Let's get the most sensational part out of the way first. I was born behind a wall. No, not in East Berlin, though from what I know now, there were similarities. My wall was made of barbed wire, the fear of God, and a total lack of Wi-Fi. For 18 years, I didn't know what a telephone was, or the internet. I was convinced that jeans were pants crafted by the devil himself to tempt the righteous, and that birthdays were a pagan ritual where you voluntarily invited a demon into your soul in exchange for some cake. To be honest, having now tried red velvet cheesecake, I'm almost ready to make that deal. Almost. For 18 years, I believed everything the prophet told us, that the world beyond our fence was damned, that outsiders were doomed to eternal torment, that we were the last pure souls on earth, a kind of elite club for saints, only instead of membership dues, we had fasting, prayers, and a disgusting lentil gruel, and then I escaped Dot, and now I'm learning how to be a person. Not a vessel for faith, not a child of the community, but just a person. One breath at a time. One awkward conversation with a barista at a time. One panic attack in the cereal aisle at a time. It's a long road, but damn it, it's mine. You know, one of the strangest things about this new world is that you can tell your story into the void and someone might answer. If my beginning sounds familiar to you, or if you're just curious how the story about escaping the Elite Saints Club ends, let me know. Apparently, there are special buttons for that here. And even a place to write a few words. To me, it's still some kind of magic. And now, let's go back to the beginning. They called it Eden's Gate. I suppose the fenced-in settlement of despair and bad soup didn't exactly roll off the tongue or attract new followers. Marketing, as I now understand, is a powerful force, even for those waiting for the end. Of the world, our Eden was a few dozen acres of land in the middle of nowhere in Northern California, surrounded by dense forest, a high barbed wire fence, and a deafening silence. The silence was the most important barrier. It seeped into your ears, your thoughts, your bones. Sometimes I think I'm still trying to shake it out of me. We wore gray. All shades of gray. From dismal pigeon to wet asphalt. The prophet said that bright colors distract the soul from thoughts of God. I now think he just bought the fabric in bulk at a discount. Our clothes were shapeless, coarse, and would get itchy in the most inconvenient places during the 3-hour sermon. We prayed 3 times a day at dawn, noon, and dusk. These weren't short words of thanks before a meal. These were full-on marathons of kneeling on a cold wooden floor while the prophet preached about sin, spiritual warfare, and how our very existence was a stain on our souls. It's amazing how many ways you can find to say, "You're all terrible." But if you do as I say, maybe God will forgive you. We were not allowed to ask questions. Curiosity was considered the seed of doubt, and doubt, as it was drilled into us, was the devil's whisper. My inner devil, it seemed, was an insufferably chatty fellow. He was constantly whispering, "But why? What if? And does God really care if I wear socks of my sandals?" Children did not belong to their parents. We belonged to the faith. It sounded very noble and spiritual, but in practice, it meant your own mother couldn't hug you if you cried without permission from an elder sister. And your father was just brother, one of many men with identically stern faces and hollow eyes. Our biological ties were earthly vanity that had to be abandoned for a higher purpose. My higher purpose at age 7 was getting an extra spoonful of applesauce, but that was not something you could talk about. We were homeschooled. Or rather, schooled in a common hall where the elder sisters taught us to read only scripture and the prophet's writings, to write by copying scripture and the prophet's writings, and to count just enough to keep track of the harvest, and the number of sins you needed to atone for. There was no geography. Why would there be, if the whole world had drowned? There was no history. It ended with the Great Flood, which, according to the prophet, had washed away all the wicked cities. Some 30 years ago. Sometimes, working in the fields, I would see a thin white streak in the sky. An airplane? "What is that, Sister Esther?" I asked once. When I was about 8, her face didn't flinch. "That is an angel's chariot, child. The angels are watching over our righteousness." I would stare at the sky for hours, trying to see the horses and winged drivers in the chariot. I never could. All I saw was something metallic, humming, flying somewhere where a fence didn't exist. Somewhere you, perhaps, didn't have to pray 3 times a day. I grew up with this thought in my head. The world beyond. The fence was a watery expanse of ruins and damned souls wandering in an eternal fog. We were told that if we ever left Eden's gate, we would burn. Not metaphorically. Literally, divine fire would incinerate our unholy bodies the moment our feet touched the cursed ground. Spoiler alert, it didn't happen. When I crossed the line, I didn't burst into flames, but the shock of meeting the real world was almost as searing. There were over 200 rules at Eden's Gate. Officially, they were recorded in the Book of Statutes, a thick, cracked leather tome that lay on a lectern next to the Bible. Unofficially, it was the longest and most tedious I have read and agreed to the terms and conditions document I have ever encountered. Only instead of giving your digital soul to Apple, you were giving your actual soul to the prophet. And there was no decline option. This spiritual bureaucracy governed our every breath. There were rules about how we walked, humbly with eyes downcast, how we ate, in silence, without looking up from our plates, how we slept on our backs, hands over the blanket, to avoid succumbing to impure thoughts in our dreams. There was a rule against whistling, because whistling is the language of serpents. There was a rule against running, unless you were fleeing from sin or rushing to do an elder's bidding. Considering everything was considered a sin, we theoretically should have been sprinting everywhere, all the time. The first category of rules was dedicated to gender apartheid. Women and girls were forbidden to look men in the eye. It was considered a brazen invitation to lust. So we spent our lives staring at the ground. I knew everyone in the community by their shoes. Brother Ezekiel wore worn-out boots with a crack on the left toe. Brother Levi had sandals with a perpetually dirty big toe. And the prophet always had the cleanest, newest shoes. Apparently, holiness protected his boots from dust and mud. We girls were forbidden from cutting our hair. It was considered a crown of glory and a sign of submission. My hair reached my lower back, was constantly tangled, fell into my soup, and snagged on branches when we worked in the woods. It wasn't a crown of glory, it was a total headache. Now I have a short pixie cut, and every time the wind touches the back of my neck, I feel like I've committed a small act of treason. And it's glorious. The second category was sensory deprivation. No music, except for approved hymns. The approved hymns were written by the prophet himself and sounded like someone trying to play a funeral march on an out-of-tune washboard. The melodies were dreary, and the lyrics were just a list of our sins and God's wrath. "Oh, we're worms in the dust, unworthy of your light." A real banger to lift your spirits first thing in the morning. Talking during meals was strictly forbidden, unless the prophet or an elder addressed you. The dining hall would fall into a silence broken only by the scraping of spoons on bowls, restrained coughs, and the loud performative chomping of the prophet, who, I guess, was demonstrating his special connection to God through food. And then there was the weekly cleansing. Every 7th morning, we were all lined up, from the youngest to the oldest, in front of the bathhouse. One by one we would enter, where 2 elder sisters in waterproof aprons whitted with buckets of ice-cold water. You were stripped naked and doused from head to toe. This was meant to wash away the filth of the week, not physical, but spiritual. It didn't matter what you did, talked back to someone, or just thought about an extra piece of bread. The icy water was meant to cool your sinful ardor. To this day, I hate cold showers. It's not invigorating. It's a reminder of standing naked, shivering, humiliated, while someone washes away sins you didn't even commit. A spiritual car wash with terrible service. If you broke a rule, you faced correction. The word itself was brilliantly chosen. It didn't sound like punishment. It Sounded like help, like fixing something broken. Sister Lydia underwent correction, they would say, and it sounded as if she'd just had a leaky faucet fixed. But in reality, correction meant standing barefoot on snow or frozen ground at the post of shame while the entire community filed. Passed on their way to morning prayer, each person obligated to look at you with righteous judgment. I remember the cold seeping up from my feet into my legs, first burning, then turning into a dull, painful numbness. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the freezing shame inside. Correction meant silence. Days, sometimes weeks, when you were forbidden to make a sound. You could work, pray silently, eat, but your voice was taken from you. It was like you were being erased from the world of the living. Correction meant shame. Public, all-consuming shame meant to be seared into your soul to remind you of your own worthlessness. When I was 10, I lay on my cot looking out the small window near the ceiling of our barracks. The night was clear, and the sky was full of stars. I had never seen anything so beautiful. The next morning at breakfast, forgetting the rule of silence, I leaned over to Sister Esther and whispered, breathless with wonder, "Sister, where do the stars go during the day?" Her face, which already resembled a dried prune, shriveled even more. She didn't say a word. She just grabbed my elbow, her fingers digging into my arm like talons, and dragged me to the head INSTRUCTRESS. My curiosity was deemed an idle question, leading the mind away from God to vain contemplations of celestial bodies. My correction lasted a week. A week of silence. I remember how desperately I wanted to talk. Not about anything important. Just to ask someone to pass the salt, to say I'd finished my chore. But the words were stuck in my throat, locked away by a will that was not my own. I screamed in my mind. I argued. I sang songs I made up in my head. I thought about the stars. I thought about them all week. Where did they go? Did they hide? Or did their light just drown in the light of the sun? They wanted to silence me too. Stop me from thinking. But they achieved the opposite. During that week of silence, my inner world became louder than any sermon. I didn't speak not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't allowed to. And that, I now realize, is the most terrifying form of control when they take not just your voice, but the very possibility of using it. His name was Elias Shepherd. Of course, Shepherd. As in, shepherd. In retrospect, the name is so on the nose it borders on bad taste, like a dentist named Dr. Drill, but back then it seemed providential. He was our shepherd, and we were his obedient, uniformly shorn flock. We just called him the prophet. To use his earthly name was a kind of familiarity, like calling God by his first name. The prophet was a tall, thin man with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look not into your soul, but directly at a list of your most recent sins. He had a well-groomed white beard that gave him the air of a biblical patriarch, and hands with long, slender fingers that used to gesture so artfully during his sermons. He was the only one allowed to wear clothes that weren't gray. Usually, it was a simple but well-made white shirt. Against our gray mass, he looked like a single light bulb in a dark cellar. Bright, magnetic, and the only source of light, he claimed that God spoke to him directly. Not through prayer or vague signs, but in full-blown cinematic visions. Sometimes it would happen right in the middle of a sermon. He would fall silent mid-sentence. His eyes would glaze over, and he would stare at a point somewhere beyond. Our heads. A dead silence would fall over the hall as everyone held their breath, afraid to scare away the divine revelation. Then he would begin to speak in a low, strained voice, describing what was being shown to him. Rivers of fire consuming the cities of sinners, angels forging swords for the final battle, or much more frequently, a direct command that we needed to work in the fields for 2 extra hours because faith without works is dead, and weeds are a metaphor for sin, brothers and sisters, and we must pull them out by the root. It's amazing how often divine visions coincided with the farm work schedule. The prophet had 4 wives. Not sequentially, but simultaneously. In a world where even looking at a man was considered a sin, This polygamy was an absolute anomaly that no one dared to question. It was explained to us that these were not marriages in the earthly, carnal sense. They were spiritual unions. The prophet, as the purest and most spiritually strong, was taking on the burden of female nature so that through him they could approach salvation. His wives, whom we simply called the mothers of the faith, were quiet, pale women who only appeared in public during sermons, sitting in the front row like living exhibits of his holiness. They never smiled. Their faces were frozen masks of piety. Sometimes I would look at them and wonder, do they really believe this? Or are they just more scared than the rest of us? His sermons were built on 3 pillars: purity, sacrifice, and spiritual warfare. Purity wasn't just the absence of sin. It was a state of constant vigilance. You had to monitor not only your actions, but your thoughts. Thought about how delicious yesterday's stewed carrots were? Gluttony. Saw a beautiful sunset and felt joy instead of humble reverence for the Creator? Pride. Purity was an unattainable ideal, and that was intentional. We were all unclean by default, and only He, the prophet, knew how to cleanse us. Sacrifice was our daily currency. We sacrificed comfort, sleep, personal belongings, which we didn't have anyway, and ties to our families. But the ultimate sacrifice was our individuality. You must die to yourself to be born in the faith, he would say. We had to erase our desires, our dreams, our opinions, to become blank slates on which he could write the will of God. And spiritual warfare was a brilliant tool of manipulation. We weren't just hermit farmers. We were soldiers on the front line of a battle with Satan. The entire outside world was enemy-occupied territory. A failed crop? The devil sent a drought. Someone got sick? A demonic attack. This constant paranoia turned our fence from a simple enclosure into a magical barrier protecting us from legions of darkness. And it justified everything. The isolation, the strict rules, the total control. We were under siege and in a besieged fortress. You don't question the commander's orders. He said that women were vessels. Vessels for faith, vessels for bearing a new, pure generation. Our value is determined by our ability to be submissive and fertile. Children were not the fruit of love, but proof of faith. The more children in the community, the more God favored. Yes. I once heard the elder sisters discussing the teenage girls, myself included, using terminology I would now only expect to hear on a livestock farm. Ripening, ready to bear fruit. I wasn't seen as a person. I was an incubator on legs. One night, after a particularly harsh correction for some minor infraction, I was crying in my cot quietly, so no one would hear. The prophet's words echoed in my head. Doubt is the devil's. Whisper. I repeated it to myself over and over. Doubt is the devil's whisper. Doubt is the devil's whisper. I was trying to drown out the pain, the humiliation, the injustice. I was trying to convince myself that I was the bad one, the sinful one, and that he was right. It was my mantra, my way of surviving, my shield against my own thoughts. But even then, in the dark, choking on tears and repeating his words, something inside me doubted. A small, stubborn flame that just wouldn't go out. If God speaks to you, I thought, why does he tell you that you should have the warmest boots while the children are cold? If we are all equal before him, why do you eat meat while we eat lentils? This whisper was quiet, much quieter than the prophet's thunderous sermons, but this was my whisper, not the devil's, mine. The system the prophet built was nearly perfect. Like a clockwork mechanism where every gear was a person and the lubricant was fear. It was designed to suppress individuality, eradicate doubt, and turn people into obedient robots in gray robes. But even the most perfect mechanisms develop cracks over time, metal fatigue, imperceptible wear and tear. And sometimes a single stone cast into the smooth surface of a lake. The stone that broke the surface for me was Ruth. The first time I doubted, truly, fundamentally, it wasn't because of hunger or cold or another absurd sermon. It happened when Ruth disappeared. She was 15, a year younger than me. A quiet, sweet girl with the eyes of a frightened fawn and a smile so rare and timid that when it appeared, it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds in our perpetually overcast community. We weren't close friends, close friendship was. Discouraged as it created unhealthy attachments that distracted from God. But we often worked together, weeding the gardens or in the laundry, exchanging silent, knowing glances when a particular rule seemed especially ridiculous. One evening, she was there washing sheets with me in a giant tub, humming a forbidden tune she said she'd heard in a dream. The next morning, her cot was empty, neatly made as if she were about to return, but she didn't. Not for morning prayer, not for breakfast, not for work in the fields. She had just vanished. No goodbyes, no explanations. Her name was no longer spoken as if it had never existed. At first, whispers rippled through the community. We younger girls exchanged scared glances, trying to find answers in each other's eyes. A couple of days later, seeing our confusion, the prophet called an emergency sermon. He stood before us, tall and unperturbed, and announced that Sister Ruth had been so pure of soul, so righteous, that God had deemed her worthy and taken her. To him, ahead of schedule. She was taken by the angels, directly from our community, as the greatest sign of God's favor upon us. He spoke of it with such solemn pride that some of the older women began to weep with rapturous joy. We were supposed to be happy for Ruth. She had achieved the ultimate goal, but I wasn't happy. Something about the story felt wrong. Angels? Seriously? The same ones that flew in metal chariots? They just came down and took her? In the middle of the night, quietly, without a goodbye, and then I saw her shoes. We all left our work shoes on a common shelf by the barracks entrance. And there, in the farthest corner, were her worn-out shoes, one slightly askew, as if kicked off in a hurry. If angels take you to heaven, you don't leave your shoes behind. Do you? You don't leave barefoot. Or maybe heaven has its own dress code, and earthly shoes are a violation. The questions swarmed in my head, buzzing like a disturbed beehive. The next day, gathering all the courage I had, which at that point was about the size of a pea, I approached Elder Sister Esther. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought the whole community could hear it. "Sister," I whispered, staring at her boots, "I don't understand. If the angels took Ruth, why are her shoes still here?" Esther's face turned to stone. For a second, I thought I saw something like fear in her eyes, but it was just a flash. She grabbed my arm and dragged me to the correction spot. This time there was no snow, no post of shame. My punishment was to move rocks from one end of a field to the other, all day, in complete silence. Hard labor cleanses the mind of idle thoughts. She hissed as I hauled the heavy, sharp rocks. I could feel the pain in my arms and back trying to drown out the pain in my soul, but it wasn't working. With every rock I lifted, what grew inside me wasn't humility, but a dull, cold rage. They were lying. I didn't know what happened to Ruth. Maybe she ran away. Maybe something terrible happened to her. But I knew one thing for sure. She wasn't taken by angels. And all of them, the adults, knew it and were lying to our faces. The wall had cracked, and through that crack, for the first time, I saw not God's plan, but a grotesque construct of lies and fear. That's when I started writing. It was the riskiest thing I could imagine. Keeping a personal journal was strictly forbidden. All our thoughts were supposed to be open to the community and the prophet, but I couldn't hold it inside anymore. I found a pencil stub in a shed. I would pull threads from the seam of my mattress and hide tiny folded scraps of paper there, stolen from the pantry packing slips, old instructions. It was my diary, my rebellion. I wrote down my doubts. I wrote about Ruth. I described the faces of the elders when they lied. I wrote down the questions I didn't dare ask out loud. Why is the prophet's God so cruel? Why does heaven for Ruth look like an escape? Those small scraps, covered in my crooked handwriting, became my only island of freedom. They were proof that I still existed, that my mind was my own, The wall was still standing, but now I knew it wasn't solid. And I began to look for other cracks. After Ruth's disappearance and the start of my secret journal, my world split into 2 layers. The outer one, where I was the same obedient, silent Sister Lydia, humbly lowering my eyes and mechanically doing my work, and the inner one, where I was an observer, an analyst, a spy behind enemy lines. I started noticing details I'd ignored before. The quick, anxious glances some of the elder brothers exchanged when they thought no one was watching. The way the prophet would sometimes slip up, mentioning brand names or things from the damned world. The nearly invisible privileges his inner circle enjoyed thought my quiet rebellion was fermenting in the darkness of my mattress, but I didn't know what to do with it. Escaping alone seemed impossible. I was a girl with no money, no knowledge of the outside world, which I now suspected wasn't flooded but was surely dangerous. I wasn't afraid of divine fire anymore, but of very real threats. Hunger, cold, people who could hurt me. My cage was awful, but it was familiar. The world beyond the fence was a terrifying unknown. Everything changed when, at 17, I was transferred from the fields and the laundry to the kitchens. Kitchen duty was hard work, but it had one huge advantage: access to information. The kitchen was the community's nerve center. All of the news and gossip flowed here, brought by sisters coming for produce or returning dishes. And it was also where Caleb worked. Caleb was 19. He was the son of one of the elders, but he had none of their pompous piety. He was quiet, not out of fear or humility, but by nature. He moved with a smooth economy of motion, whether he was peeling potatoes or chopping wood. But the most important thing about him was his eyes. They were intelligent, observant, and they lacked the fog of fanaticism that clouded the gazes of most of Eden's residents. When he looked at you, it felt like he saw not a sister in the faith, but a person. We rarely spoke, it was too risky. But sometimes, passing him a sack of flour or a pot of water, our fingers would brush, and that brief contact was enough to understand. He saw it too. He saw through the whole masquerade. He was one of the few men in whose presence I didn't feel like an object or a vessel. With him, I felt like myself. One afternoon, the kitchen was in an uproar. We were preparing for yet another festival of humility and harvest, which meant double the work for us and a double portion of turkey for the prophet and his circle. I was scrubbing a huge pot, elbow deep in greasy water. Caleb walked by with an armful of firewood. As he passed, he accidentally tripped and dropped a log near me. I bent down to pick it up, and as he bent down too, he quickly pressed a tiny, tightly rolled piece of paper into my hand and whispered so quietly, his words were almost lost in the kitchen noise. "Read it later, alone." My heart plummeted into my stomach. I clutched the paper in my wet fist, feeling a wave of icy fear wash over me. What was this? Was he turning me in? Had he noticed the way I looked at things and decided to report me to the elders? I finished, washing the pot on autopilot, my mind frantically racing through the worst-case scenarios. Only late that night, in the darkness of the barracks, under my blanket, did I dare to unroll the note. My fingers were trembling. On the tiny scrap of paper, torn, it seemed, from a sugar sack, a few words were scrawled. "Hole in the west fence, midnight, 3 days." I read it again and again. A hole in the fence, midnight, 3 days. It wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation. An invitation to escape. I didn't sleep for the next 3 days. Or 3 nights. I lay with my eyes open, listening to the snores and sleepy murmurs of the other girls, and my mind became a battlefield. One part of me screamed, "Run! This is your only chance. This is what you've wanted." This part thought of Ruth, of the icy water, of the prophet's lies, of a life where you could laugh out loud and read books that weren't about sin. The other part, cowardly and ingrained in me over 18 years, whispered, "You can't do it. Where will you go? What will you do? They'll catch you. They'll bring me back. And then your correction will make hauling rocks feel like a pleasant stroll." And what if the prophet is right? What if there really is only death and damnation out there? I weighed the risks. To stay was a slow, guaranteed death of the soul. To leave was a chance at life, but with a huge risk of failure and a much swifter, more agonizing punishment. On the second day, I ran into Caleb at the well. We were alone for a few seconds. I just looked at him, my expression holding all my fear and indecision. He gave a barely perceptible nod, and in his eyes, I read not a command or a plea, but a simple statement. I'm going. The choice is yours. He wasn't pressuring me. He was giving me a choice. And that the right to my own choice was the final straw. Here, I never had a choice. I didn't pack anything. I had nothing that could be called my things. All I did on that last night was put on 2 sets of undergarments and 2 gray robes, one over the other. That was the sum of my worldly possessions. I took my tiny archive from my mattress, all my notes, my journal of doubt. I folded them carefully and tucked them into the waistband of my bottom robe, tying a piece of rope around my waist to keep them from falling out. Those scraps of paper were more important than any clothing. They were my history, my proof. That night, I skipped evening prayer, claiming to feel unwell. I lay on my cot, listening to the sounds of the community falling asleep. When all was quiet and only the moon shone through the small window, I slipped out of the barracks. I walked, hiding in the shadows of the buildings, my heart beating a funeral march against my ribs. Every crunch of gravel underfoot sounded deafening. I was waiting for a shout, for the beam of a flashlight. For hands to grab me. I thought the moment I decided to run, I'd be struck by lightning, that the earth itself would swallow me whole. But nothing happened. All I heard was the wind. It rustled in the leaves of the trees, and it was the freest and most terrifying sound of my life. It was calling me forward. I found Caleb where he said he'd be by the western part of the fence, in the shadow of a thicket of wild blackberries. He stood motionless, a shadow blending into the night. When I approached, he didn't say a word, just put a finger to his lips and pointed to the bottom of the fence. The hole was small, cut through the chain link, probably with wire cutters. It was covered with branches. If he didn't know where to look, it was almost impossible to spot. He motioned for me to go first. I got on my knees, feeling the dew-soaked grass chill my skin. My heart was pounding in my throat. As I crawled through the hole, my rope snagged on a sharp edge of the wire. The fabric ripped. For a second, I froze, certain the sound had woken. The entire community, that spotlights would flash on and dogs would start barking. Though we didn't have dogs. The prophet considered them unclean animals, but nothing happened. Caleb quickly scrambled through after me. We were outside. We stood on the other side of the fence, and the world hadn't collapsed. The sky hadn't fallen. A rain of fire didn't consume us. It was the same night, the same moon, the same stars. But the air was different. It smelled different. Not of smoke from the kitchen stoves or manure from the farm. It smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and freedom. It was the smell of a world that lived its own life, indifferent to our prayers and rules. Follow me and be quiet, Caleb whispered. They were the first words he'd spoken to me that night, and we went. We ran, really. Crouched down at first until we were past the open field, and then, once we were deep in the woods, we broke into a brisk walk. We were barefoot. Taking off your shoes before leaving the barracks was a mandatory rule, and we couldn't risk going back for them. The cold, wet ground, littered with pine needles, rocks, and twigs, dug into the soles of our feet. Every step was a small torture, but adrenaline and fear dulled the pain. I don't know how long we walked, an hour? 2? Time blurred into a continuous stream of darkness, heavy breathing, and the rustle of our feet on the forest floor. I didn't dare look back. I was afraid of seeing the lights of a search party, of hearing shouts. I just stared at Caleb's back and forced myself to keep moving. We walked, as he later told me, about 6 miles. 6 miles barefoot through a forest at night. When we finally emerged from the trees onto something hard and flat, I almost collapsed from exhaustion. It was a road, a black, smooth strip of asphalt gleaming in the moonlight. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. I knew of roads from scripture, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. And here I was, standing on one of them. In the distance, two lights appeared. They grew, got closer, turning into blinding beams. I shrank back into the bushes in terror. It's a car, Caleb said calmly. They can help us. He stepped out to the edge of the road and raised his hand. I stared at him, frozen with horror. He was voluntarily drawing the attention of this roaring metal monster. The car slowed and stopped beside us. The passenger side window slid down smoothly, which in itself seemed like magic to me. A woman was inside. She had short red hair and something bright red on her lips. She looked at us with concern. "Hey, are you two okay? What are you doing out here in the middle of the night?" she asked. I couldn't speak. I had never spoken to an outsider before. A woman with lipstick who wasn't wearing a head covering. I just stood there, clutching my robe, trembling from cold or shock, or both. Caleb, to my amazement, spoke to her. Calmly and evenly. We got lost. Our car broke down a ways back. Could you give us a ride to the nearest town? It was a lie. A quick, convincing lie. I didn't know he had it in him. The woman looked us over. Our gray, filthy robes, our bare, scratched feet, my terrified eyes. She must have known we were lying. Get in, she said after a pause, popping the back door open. Inside of the car smelled of something sweet and chemical. I scrambled awkwardly onto the back seat, which was soft and springy. It was so strange. The woman handed us a bottle of water. I took several greedy gulps. The water was clean, with no taste of iron like the water from our well. Then she gave. You saw. A blanket. It was made of some impossibly soft material, and when I wrapped it around myself, I started to shake even more. It was the first act of simple human kindness I had ever received from a stranger. Are you hungry? She asked, looking at us in the rearview mirror. We both nodded silently. She rummaged in a bag on the front seat and handed me something wrapped. In wax paper. Here, take this. It's all I've got. I unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a sandwich. 2 pieces of soft, porous bread, and between them, a brown paste and dark red jelly. Peanut butter and jelly, she explained, seeing my confusion. Took a bite, and in that moment, my world exploded. Sweet, salty, sticky, fragrant. The taste was so powerful, so incredible that I couldn't stop myself. I started to cry. Quietly, soundlessly, the tears just rolled down my cheeks, mixing with the dirt and exhaustion. I wasn't crying from grief or fear. I was crying over a sandwich, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, because it was real, and it was delicious. And no one was telling me that eating it was a sin. That sandwich wasn't just food. It tasted like rebellion. It tasted like freedom. It tasted like the beginning of a new, unknown, terrifying, and amazingly delicious life. It's been 7 months since that night. 7 months that feel like both an eternity and a single, blurry, chaotic moment. That woman, the angel in a used sedan named Sarah, didn't just drop us off in town. She took us to the police station where Caleb and I, stumbling over our words, told our story. Then came social services, temporary shelters, endless questions and forms. The world crashed down on me in an avalanche of bureaucracy, unfamiliar words, and procedures that were almost as incomprehensible as the rituals in Eden, but at least didn't involve buckets of ice water. Now I have a room, my own room with a door that closes. The first week, I slept on the floor because the bed felt too soft, too luxurious. I have a toothbrush, my own. Not a communal one we disinfected in vinegar. I have shoes with laces. I bought them myself with the first money I ever earned. I was a dishwasher in a small cafe, and when I got my first paycheck crumb bills. In an envelope, I stood in the middle of the street and cried, just like in the car over the sandwich. Only this time, the tears were for the taste not of rebellion, but of independence. I learned how to Google. Oh my God, Google. It's like having access to the brain of all humanity. For the first few weeks, I sat in the public library for hours. Obsessed. Where do the stars go during the day? Was my first search. The answer was both disappointingly scientific and breathtakingly beautiful. I Googled everything. Why is the sky blue? What is sarcasm? How to use a microwave? The history of jeans. Turns out they weren't invented by the devil, but by some guy named Levi Strauss for gold miners. And they are damn comfortable. But freedom isn't just Google and jeans. It's also panic attacks in the most unexpected places. I remember the first time I walked into a big supermarket. I was standing in the breakfast cereal aisle and I was being stared down by dozens, hundreds of boxes. With raisins, with honey, with chocolate in the shape of rings, squares, stars. At Eden's Gate, we only had oatmeal, no sugar. There was no choice. And here there was too much choice. I didn't know what to do. How do you choose? What if I choose wrong? What if I don't like it? I felt the walls closing in, the air getting thick, and I just ran out of the store gasping for air. I cried on a bench in the parking lot for half an hour because I couldn't choose my own breakfast cereal. I'd go to therapy. My therapist, doctor, Miller, is a patient woman with kind eyes who doesn't look surprised when I tell her about the rules, the punishments, and the profit. She gave my feelings names: post-traumatic stress disorder, complex trauma, the effects of indoctrination. Apparently, there are actual scientific terms for my brand of crazy. For some reason, that's comforting. We're learning how to breathe. Just breathe when a wave of fear washes over me. Inhale, exhale. One breath at a time. I still flinch when someone raises their voice near me or moves their hand too quickly. I still wake up before dawn with the subconscious feeling that I'm late for morning prayer. Sometimes, walking past a church, I feel an irrational, primal fear. Old ghosts don't just disappear. They sit in the dark corners of my mind and sometimes whisper familiar words. You are unclean. You are unworthy. You will burn. But now I have another voice. My own, and it's getting louder. It says, you are safe. You are strong. You have the right to choose. Asterisk, I've learned to laugh. A real from the gut laugh. I was watching a comedy series recently, and there was a joke about how hard it is to assemble furniture from IKEA. I laughed until I cried, because it was so simple, so mundane, so far removed from spiritual warfare and eternal damnation. Caleb, who now lives in the next town over and is training to be a car mechanic, says my laugh sounds like wind chimes. I like that. I'm writing this journal. Not on scraps of paper hidden in the mattress anymore, but in a real notebook I bought. Myself, I'm writing it for me, so I don't forget where I came from. And I'm also writing it for anyone who grew up in a cage made of holy texts and fear. It doesn't matter what your cage was called, Eden's Gate, the family of light, or just a toxic family with a tyrant at the head. You are not crazy. You are not alone. And you are not, damn it, cursed out this world. It's big, complicated, sometimes scary, but it is not cursed. It's full of peanut butter sandwiches, stupid comedies, inconvenient furniture, and people who might hand you a blanket for no reason at all. I was born in a cult, but I will not die in one. This life, this freedom, it's mine now. If you have your own story of escaping a cage, big or small, I would love to hear it. Leave it below. This space, this channel, I want it to be a place where those stories can be told without fear. Subscribe if you want to be a part of this. Because the most important lesson I've learned out here is that we get stronger when we stop being silent.